My name is Hartford Van Dyke. I've been invited to speak on this, and I'm going to start with a small biography. I was born in 1940, June 4th, 1940. I was born in Hawaii, Honolulu, Hawaii, and my father's uncle, Gerald Mason Van Dyke, was in G2 intelligence. In 1941, there was a Pearl Harbor attack. I was 18 months old when that happened. My father has a story of what happened. I'm going to read it to you. After that story, I will explain to you a few more things that I learned in life that I think will help you understand the problems you're having today. This is material that was provided by my father. An account of the Japanese Pearl Harbor attack, December 7th, 1941, by Lyle Hartford Van Dyke Sr. Material provided at 6/1/75. Here's my father's story. I met General Short on a couple of occasions, and he always impressed me as being a man of intelligence, honesty, and integrity. I feel deeply that he was not guilty of any dereliction of duty in any way. In fact, the whole Pearl Harbor attack was planned and engineered by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt wanted the American people to be so angry they would fight both Germany and Japan. General Short and Admiral Kimmel were both the fall guys for Roosevelt's nefarious crimes. They were falsely charged and falsely prosecuted by the judiciary to protect President Roosevelt in one of the most infamous crimes ever perpetrated on the American people. He goes on to say, now refer to Chapter 14, page 68, The Skeleton in Uncle Sam's Closet, by Hartford Van Dyke. I wrote the book, The Skeleton in Uncle Sam's Closet. It was published in 1973. I'm going back to this writing now. Mason Van Dyke's warning. The thing he's referring to is Mason Van Dyke's warning about impending Japanese attack. I met my uncle Mason. He was living in Hawaii at the time. My father met my mother there. They were married. And that was, my dad had been there since about 1935. So he goes on and he says, I met my Uncle Mason coming out of a barber shop on Baratania Street. We talked for a few moments, and I asked him why all the sandbags around the power plant, which was across the street. He said they had been put there for maneuvers, but he hoped they would not be removed because a very serious situation had developed. I asked what it was. He said the Japanese fleet was steaming toward Hawaii. I replied, quote, does this mean we are going to be attacked by the Japanese, unquote? He said, quote, from all appearances, yes, unquote. I was scared and speechless for a few moments. Finally, I said, have you warned Roosevelt in the War Department in Washington, D.C.? He said, yes. A message was sent to them yesterday. That would be Thursday, 2:00 p.m. Honolulu time, unquote. Quote, when do you expect the attack? I asked. Either, quote, either Sunday or Monday, he replied, according to the weather. Sunday, December 7th, 1941, was a beautiful day in Hawaii. It was an day for an attack. The airplanes that were not shot down found their carriers at sea without much trouble. I said, what can I do to protect my wife and son and myself? I don't have a gun or anything with which I can fight. My uncle said, put mattress on, quote, put mattress on top of another mattress and get under the bed when the shooting starts, because they will not be shooting small caliber guns when they come in, unquote. I wasn't panicking, but I was scared. Quote, what do we do for food if the island is under siege, unquote. He said, quote, lay in a supply of canned goods so you won't go hungry, unquote. Uncle Mason said, what I am telling you is secret, and not one word is to be said to your wife or anyone, unquote. This was agreed to, and to this day I have never told Hartford's mother anything about the impending attack on Pearl Harbor. On Saturday morning, I went to Honolulu Drayage Company and bought some cases of canned food that had been slightly damaged. My wife thought that I had lost my mind when I came in with cases of canned food. I explained it away by saying I got the food for practically nothing, so I couldn't turn it down. Uncle Mason said to turn off the hot water heater and drain water for drinking and cooking purposes after the attack to prevent poisoning should the water supply be sabotaged. Also fill the bathtub with water. This was done after the attack. On Saturday night we were out late. About 6 a.m. Sunday morning the phone rang and I was awakened by a pilot from Inter-Island Airlines who was a member of our flying club. He said, Lyle, quote, Lyle, are you going to fly the club plane around the island? You have it booked for this time, unquote. I said, go ahead and fly it yourself. I'm too sleepy. I went back to bed and went sound asleep. A little after 7 a.m., December 7th, I heard loud bombing sounds and rolled over in bed and said, quote, boy, they're having maneuvers close to shore this morning, unquote. I was really scared, but I didn't let on as to what was going on. When the bombing got pretty loud, I heard a bang, bang on the front door and somebody yelling, Lyle, Lyle. I got out of bed and went to the front door and found my neighbor, John Linzer, yelling, the Japanese are attacking. The Japanese are attacking, unquote. I said, quote, yeah, unquote. He said, what did you say? In a very harsh manner, unquote. Realizing that I had almost let the cat out of the bag, I said, quote, what did you say, John? He replied, the Japanese are attacking. And I said, I misunderstood you. And I rushed to the bedroom to tell my wife, who by this time was out of bed, had a robe on, and on her way out to the bathroom. Pandemonium broke loose. I decided to crawl up on top of the house and see where the planes were bombing. A shell or bomb went off close to the water tank on top of the hill above where we lived in Manoa Valley. I came off at the top of the house in a hurry. I then went around the hill and stood at a vantage point and watched the planes bomb Pearl Harbor and Hickam Field. The planes dived on the ships, and each time you would see plumes of smoke and parts of ships flying in all directions. When a plane dived on a building at Hickam Field, you could see the building explode and debris fall in all directions. It was a sickening sight to see. I knew people were being killed, but I couldn't do anything to stop it. I thought of the anguish and mental torture my Uncle Mason was suffering. Because I was suffering the same way, Well, that's the end of the sentence. What could I do but protect myself and family as much as possible? A call came over the radio for blood donors at the Queen's Hospital. Forgetting all danger, I jumped in my car and headed for the hospital to give blood. When I got there, seriously wounded soldiers, sailors, and civilians were lying on stretchers all the way up the sidewalk. It looked like the movie Gone with the Wind. Some were dying, others begging for water and moaning in pain. I took a clean handkerchief out of my pocket, wet it, and wiped their mouths and let them suck on the wet cloth. This seemed to satisfy their thirst for the moment. I went into the hospital where the halls were full of people trying to give blood. I was warm. I was warm when I walked in, and the halls were stifling hot. I started to faint, and somebody grabbed me and took me outside. After a few moments, I returned and said I wanted to go to the operating room and help. I walked into the operating room just in time to see them complete the removal of a man's leg. This was too much for me to take. I got real sick and had to leave the hospital without giving blood. I had worked for nearly 3 years with my Uncle Dan, Cecil, in Hinton, Oklahoma, who owned an undertaking and furniture business. It was not difficult for me to work around the dead because they were out of their misery, and I had had the desirable experience, and I had had considerable experience in helping embalm and directing funerals, etc. I volunteered my services and went out to Hickam Field and helped take the soldiers from the barracks where they were killed while eating their breakfast. A large bomb had struck the building, completely destroying it. When I walked into the mess hall area, the first dead person I saw was my best friend, Bill Northway. We used to attend church in Epworth League together at the Methodist Church. I believe it was located on Baratania Street, close to where the Williams Mortuary was located. He had one real small gash on his wrist, otherwise there was not a mark on him. He was killed instantly by concussion. Later I took care of him at Williams Mortuary on Baratania Street, along with other friends and my flight instructor. A close friend, Bob Tice, who was shot through the head while propping a plane at his flying service on John Rogers Airfield. That was his flight instructor. I personally conducted Bob's funeral on Tuesday morning at graveside services. I personally bought blue velvet and covered the wooden box in which he was buried. It was the same type of wooden box as was used for our soldiers and 2 Japanese officers who were shot down. The Army used regular trucks like they haul troops in for maneuvers. They placed 8 bodies in each truck. The trucks were lined up for blocks. I was placed in charge of the detail from about 2 o'clock in the afternoon to midnight. Because of my former experience in the undertaking business, I did my share of crying, and so did the soldiers who helped identify, if possible, through clothing, labels, fingerprints, and personal effects, the bodies as they were taken from the trucks and placed in wooden boxes. Those boxes were being cut and nailed together by civilians and soldiers at a furniture factory across the fence north of Williams Mortuary. Some of the seemingly hardened individuals broke down and wept when they saw their close friends brought in on the truck and they didn't suspect they had been killed. We had a routine for putting the boxes in the wooden. Oh, we had a routine for putting the bodies in the wooden boxes. The Army had to prevent the possibility of an epidemic, so we used formaldehyde in abundance. First, a new khaki Army blanket was placed across the top of the box and pushed down inside to cover the sides. Then sawdust was put on top of the blanket. Then formaldehyde was poured on the sawdust. The body was then placed on the sawdust. If the body was not mutilated, the blanket was wrapped over the body and more formaldehyde poured on the blanket. The lid was then nailed securely on the box. If the body was mutilated, as most of them were, then sawdust was placed on the body and more formaldehyde poured on the sawdust. The blanket was then folded around them and more formaldehyde was poured on the blanket. We had 227 of our soldiers stacked 4 deep in Williams Mortuary at one time. We had a very unusual experience to happen when it came to when it came time to load trucks to go down to the Punch Bowl Military Cemetery. Some officer went down to the Filipino neighborhood and brought a half dozen Filipinos to Williams Mortuary to load the boxes into the trucks. The men came in and looked around acted like they were scared to death. One of the men said, "What's in those boxes?" The officer replied, they are our dead soldiers and flyers." The men turned and ran out of the mortuary and ran down the street as fast as they could run. They were running at breakneck speed when they were out of sight. When they went out of sight, our own soldiers, with the help of the officers, loaded the trucks and drove to the Punch Bowl Cemetery. 2 weeks after the blitz on Pearl Harbor, I got a job at Ford Island Naval Air Base, Pearl Harbor, because I was a pilot and quite well versed in airplane parts, etc. I was put in charge of airplane engines, parts, accessories, and instruments for the Naval Air Station. I was under a Mr. Warren, who was in general charge of engines, parts, etc., who was directly under Captain Hartford, who was in charge of all repairs, etc., for Naval Air Station Ford Island. After many harrowing experiences, too numerous to mention, I came back to the mainland and lived in Los Angeles for 1.5 years before moving to Portland, Oregon in November of 1943. Having had all the experiences I had before, during and after the Pearl Harbor Blitz, I was endeavoring to find what happened to the chain of command that would let such a dastardly thing as the Blitz of Pearl Harbor happen. It was more than a curiosity that kept me delving into the Pearl Harbor debacle. I didn't know Admiral Kimmel and had met General Short only on a couple of occasions. It didn't seem possible that a man of General Short's stature would be a party to the murdering of nearly 4,000 of our soldiers, sailors, Marines, and civilians at Pearl Harbor. There was a missing link, and I was determined to find it, and I found it after nearly 20 years of searching. I was on a rest-a-phone recruiting and training trip to Washington, D.C. and New York City. I had gone to Washington, D.C. I will explain that here, just a little insert. My father was the inventor of the rest-a-phone, telephone rest, that you clamp onto the telephone handset and you could put it on your shoulder to leave both hands free to work. For many years he sold that. He invented it. I'll go back. Having had all the experiences I had before, during, and after the Pearl Harbor Blitz, I was endeavoring to find what happened to the chain of command that would let such a dastardly thing as the Blitz of Pearl Harbor happen. It was more than a curiosity that kept me delving into the Pearl Harbor debacle. I didn't know Admiral Kimmel, and I met General Short on only a couple occasions. It didn't seem possible that a man of General Short's stature would be a party to the murdering of nearly 4,000 of our soldiers, sailors, Marines, and civilians at Pearl Harbor. There was a missing link, and I was determined to find it, and I found it after nearly 20 years of searching. I was on a rest-a-phone recruiting and training trip to Washington, D.C. and New York City. I had gone to Washington, D.C. 2 days early so I could attend the Human Events political conference and work with my salesman in the evening. Human Events was the name of a magazine. So I was seeing, find out where it was. I had gone to Washington, D.C. 2 days early so I could attend the Human Events political conference and work with my salesman in the evening. I was seated at a long banquet table, which was one of several. Seated next to me was a distinguished gentleman who spoke softly and lucidly. We talked about several things, and somehow Pearl Harbor was mentioned. I told him I was in Honolulu during the Blitz, that I had lived in the islands for over 7 years. I told him I knew about the impending Jap. I told him I knew about the impending attack on Friday afternoon before that had happened on Sunday morning. This gentleman acted very interested in what I had to say and started to pinpoint and question me about details. After I'd given him all the information he asked me for, he said, Mr. Van Dyke, do you know who I am? Unquote. I said, I don't know who you are from Adam. He said, my fingers covered me. He said, let me introduce myself. He reached in his billfold and pulled out his personal card, handed it to me and said, I am Admiral Paulus Prince Powell, United States Navy retired. Do you know what I did during World War II? Unquote. I said, I imagine you were at sea fighting the battles like a lot of other admirals. Unquote. Quote, Mr. Van Dyke, I was at the Naval Intelligence Office in Washington, D.C., and received your uncle's message you told me about a few minutes ago. You are the first human being to ever tell me the exact time and content of the message that was sent on Thursday, December 4th, 1941, at approximately 2 o'clock p.m. Honolulu time. I know you knew of the impending attack, or you could not relate the facts as they were. Now, would you like to know what happened in Washington, D.C. when your uncle's message was received by my office? Unquote. I replied, quote, I would like to know because I have never heard a logical explanation in the last 19 years. Maybe you can give it to me. Unquote. I had waited and inquired, trying to find out what happened in Washington, D.C. that had led up to the infamous Pearl Harbor attack. My answer was not to be denied. In the interest of cutting down on time and space, I shall let the tape recording, which incidentally I didn't know was being made, suffice for Admiral Powell's explanation of the events that took place. See, and then he refers to some of the stuff I published eventually. I was utterly amazed at the remarks he made about President. He comes back here in his second writing and explains that particular part later. He gave additional information in November 7th, 1976, which fills this gap that he just left. In the interest of cutting down on time and space, I shall let the tape recording, which incidentally I didn't know was being made, suffice for Admiral Powell's explanation of events. I will explain that statement after I get done reading this paper. I was utterly amazed at the remarks he made about President, this is my father again. I was utterly amazed at the remarks he made about President Roosevelt being responsible for the infamous Pearl Harbor attack, about Roosevelt making Admiral Kimmel and General Short scapegoats so that he, Roosevelt, would come out looking like a hero. Again, I wish to reiterate, Admiral Powell said, Mr. Van Dyke, when I, Admiral Powell said, quote, Mr. Van Dyke, when I die, it will be the most pleasant thing that has happened to me because I have died thousands of times, especially when I think of all the officers and enlisted men, many of them my personal friends, being killed, and I could not do a thing to save their lives, unquote. Admiral Powell told me that he thought Roosevelt, quote, Roosevelt was so low that he could walk under the belly of a snake and think he had just walked under the Empire State Building, unquote. These were his, Powell's words, not mine. He, Powell, held Roosevelt 100% responsible for the Pearl Harbor attack and was very bitter about the treatment given General Short and Admiral Kimmel. That is the material that was given to me June 1st, 1975. He later brought some additional information up he felt it was necessary to add it, provided November 7th, 1976. That statement. The following is what I would the following is what was told to me by Admiral Paulus Prince Powell, United States Navy, retired, after I had explained to him what had happened at Pearl Harbor. When I told him what had happened to me before, during, and after the infamous Pearl Harbor attack, he seemed to be relieved of a great burden he was carrying inside of him. He did not hesitate to tell me every little detail, because I know he felt he was taking on a kindred soul, that he was talking to a kindred soul who had suffered as the same as he had. Many of his friends, officers, enlisted men, etc., had been killed in the infamous Pearl Harbor attack, and his sorrow for them and their loved ones was very deep. Admiral Paulus P. Powell said, quote, I received your uncle's message on Thursday evening, Washington, D.C. time. I was shocked to receive the message, unquote. Powell said, quote, so immediately I took it to my superior, Secretary of Navy Frank Knox, who in turn immediately contacted Henry Stimson, Secretary of War. Stimson said, well, quote, let's call Roosevelt, unquote. When they called Roosevelt, he let out a barrage of curse words and said, quote, I'll be right there, unquote. This was the first time Roosevelt had ever been in the defense building. He said Pentagon, I believe. And my father was wrong in that statement. At that time, the Pentagon didn't exist, if I understand it correctly. He didn't know the name of the building. He quickly arrived at the building, according to Powell. Immediately, Secretary of the Navy Knox said to Roosevelt, quote, we must get our fleet of ships out of Pearl Harbor and set up a defense perimeter around the islands, unquote. Roosevelt exploded, Powell said. Roosevelt said, quote, I'm the commander-in-chief, and you are not going to do one goddamn thing about it. I'm running this man's army and navy. I'm the commander-in-chief, and you're not doing anything. Powell said, well, quote, well, we've got to do something to protect our men over there, our men and officers in the Navy and fleet, unquote. Roosevelt said, quote, I'm running that, and you have nothing to say about it, unquote. Powell said James Vincent Forrestal, Undersecretary of the Navy, became very upset about what he heard, and so did Knox. Forrestal insisted something be done at once to protect our men at Pearl Harbor. He insisted that something be done to counteract what was about to take place. Roosevelt became very angry at Forrestal and Knox, Powell said, so much so that he cursed a blue streak and kept telling them he was the commander-in-chief of the Army, Navy, and they were to do as he said. Powell said, Roosevelt then called in Marine Guards and put guards over Knox, Forrestal, and Powell, and made them stay in the building until after the blitz at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Powell said they had a heavy guard on them 24 hours a day. Food was brought in to them and they ate and slept there all the time. Powell said he was told to not send any messages of any sort to anyone. Powell was under close surveillance at all times. On Saturday morning, Powell said he could not take it any longer. He said he had died a thousand deaths thinking about all his friends and fellow officers who could not protect themselves and were sure to be slaughtered. Quote, I grieved over those men, Mr. Van Dyke. You cannot imagine how I grieved over them. I knew I would be shot if I even tried to warn anyone in Hawaii about what was about to happen. Finally, in desperation, I turned to Secretary Knox with tears in my eyes and said, can we do anything? Send some kind of warning to our men or word to of some sort that might let them know the impending attack? Knox said he would call in Secretary of War Stimson and see whether he could get Roosevelt to send some sort of warning to them. Unquote. Powell said Roosevelt trusted Secretary of War Stimson implicitly and did not keep him under guard at any time. Secretary Stimson talked with Secretary Knox and agreed to call Roosevelt and see whether he would let them send a message of warning to Hawaii. Secretary Stimson called Roosevelt on Saturday morning and asked if some sort of warning could be sent to the Navy and Army in Hawaii. Roosevelt said, quote, yes, send them this message. Admiral Powell said Roosevelt was cursing a blue streak. The quote goes on, expect Japanese sabotage. Admiral said he could not believe the message he heard and read. It was such a lie. Powell said, quote, is that all you're going to send to them? Unquote. Stimson in a harsh voice replied, that is what he said to send. Send it. Powell sent the message. I don't know what they had to send it, but the difference, I'm going to make a comment on this part. In the case of an aerial attack, the airplanes are separated on the ground so they can't all be hit by one bomb. And the machine gunners are people handling aircraft above the ground. In the sabotage conditions, the planes are gathered together close on the ground so they're easy to protect. And the ammunition, anti-aircraft ammunition is put underground so that it can't be stolen by the saboteurs. So what Roosevelt did was he gave the exact opposite advice that he should have. He made them more vulnerable than they were before. That's Roosevelt. My uncle received the message, and I'm going back to the text now. That is what he's talking about Roosevelt. That is what he said to send. Send it. Powell sent the message. Stimson in a harsh voice replied, that is what he said to send. Send it. Powell sent the message. My uncle received the message or was made aware of the message. While returning from Washington, D.C. and New York City, I stopped off in Oklahoma and worked with salesmen and called on my uncle, Mason Van Dyke. I told him about meeting Admiral Paulus P. Powell and finding out what had happened to his warning. I said, quote, you received a message on Saturday morning from Washington, D.C. about the impending attack, quote, unquote. He said he already knew what was going to happen. I said, a message was sent about using three words to describe an impending attack. I will give you the three words and you can join with me in giving them to me. I said, expect Japanese sabotage. He said the words exactly the same time I did. I said, "Are these the words that were sent to Hawaii?" He replied to me, quote, "To the best of my recollection, yes, they are," unquote. This was the final evidence to me that Roosevelt was the man who had carefully planned and engineered the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor. He carried out his plans so ruthlessly and cold-bloodedly that today it makes one shudder to think that the American people are letting their leaders lead them into war without ever declaring war. They are using the precedent of Franklin Delano Roosevelt for establishing sovereign immunity to do anything they choose to do by setting themselves above the common man and not having to answer to anyone. Every president since Roosevelt has used sovereign immunity in running the country, some a lot more than others. Sovereign immunity is now used as a precedent by the Supreme Court, lower courts, and the American Bar Association, lawyers, Internal Revenue Service and its agents, and allied organizations to destroy our last vestige of freedom. Wake up, America. Let's put a stop to sovereign immunity. It's not too late. Lyle H. Van Dyke. So that tells you what my father went through. Now, there are other things to add to that. I'm going to keep it simple for the time being. The Pearl Harbor attack happened, and by the time the summer of '42 rolled around, we were able to come back to the United States, to the mainland. There was a convoy that traveled that summer from Hawaii to Los Angeles, to Sacramento. I think it was San Francisco, and then we drove from there to down to Los Angeles. But a couple interesting things happened then in my life. Uh, my sister was born January 8th, 1943, in Los Angeles. My grandmother was taking care of me, and she showed me how to plug a lamp into the wall. And that was quite interesting to me that would turn the light on. Well, I happened to pick up on the idea and found a bobby pin that used to be just a piece of metal wire. They weren't even flat. The wire type bobby pins of those days. And as a child, I had the experience of taking one of those bobby pins and stretching the space between the two ends and jabbing it into an outlet. Well, you know what happens. The thing blew up, sent me crawling across the room as fast as I could go. A little bit later, I was out in the yard in the driveway, and they had a pump house there, and it was exposed wiring. So I got in there, and I could see the wires, and I got in there and crawled around, and I hit live wires, and knocked me clear across the driveway. So that invited into my mind this experience of something being so peaceful. When you look at it, it turns you such a hell of an uproar when you didn't behave yourself right. Well, my grandfather didn't want me to get killed doing this stuff. So he made me a sandbox, and he put an outlet on each side of the sandbox and got me an old uh, vacuum cleaner, floor sweeper, or whatever they called them then. Gave it to me so I could vacuum the sand inside the box quite safely. But I never forgot those experiences, and they became a foundation piece for me as I grew up because I had an intense interest in electricity because of it. We moved to Portland, Oregon in November of 1943, and I was put in a what would be called today maybe a daycare center, but it was a pre-kindergarten environment. And my mother asked the question one time of the lady. I had a bag of electrical parts. I like to have all my electrical parts. So my mother asked her, how does Hartford behave himself? She said, when he comes in here, I get out his bag of electrical plugs and I give them to him. He plays with them all day. So you can see it was getting thoroughly embedded. And then when we moved to a place on, it was called Failing Street, and I would walk the neighborhood, knock on the doors, and say, "Have you got any blown fuses?" There's one lady on the corner saying them for me. And when they were cleaning up the basement, they found a little buzzer on a concrete foundation underneath the house. A little buzzer, not a bell, a buzzer with a couple of magnets on it with wound with green wire. I can still see that thing on a mental photograph. And my mother found it and gave it to me, and I walked all the way around the neighborhood, a fairly large block, showing all the neighbors my wonderful treasure. And so there were all kinds of things interesting. The Christmas tree lights, the flasher unit you plugged in the wall, plugged the lights into it, and made the lights on the Christmas tree flash flicker. And so I had things that happened through my early years then. And our neighbor around the block, that was our babysitter, had an in-law son that was involved with electrical equipment, telephone equipment, and so forth. Anyway, make it short, we left there in 1945, went down the street to a few blocks and had the next door neighbor in Failing Street built our house for us, built it a few blocks away. And we moved there in 1945, summer of 1945. The war was still on. We didn't hear anything about it. That was something as children we weren't aware of. Now, at Christmas of 1945, my father made for me a breadboard. It's called a breadboard circuit. It was a piece of wood with a switch block, ceramic switch block that had what's called the knife switch for breaking the circuit to the two lines into the house. It had a switch and it had fuses of its own. Had one of those wires. In those days, the wires were cotton covered. Yellow and green was the type. It was on the outside of maybe a rubber foundation. And so we had the plug that went into the wall, the yellow and green wire covered wire. And the electricity went down the wire into the knife switch through the fuses and out along two wires, one on each side of the board, which is called a bus system. He had just a switch and a light socket there, and he had an outlet there. And it was to introduce me to the idea of schematic diagrams and to show me how electrical circuits worked. And that was, my mother said, "Do you think he can handle that?" He said, "I think he can handle it." He believed it because I had survived the other two things. So I was influenced that way. I was given a train set, a Lionel train set. I learned how to study it, to tear it all apart. When I was 10 years old, and I learned about telephone systems and telephone switching equipment. If a telephone company man entered the neighborhood, which was 5 blocks long, and I saw him, I beat his deadline right over to that point, started begging stuff off of him. I had a little cart that I couldn't afford the shafts to hold the wheels, so I begged nails off the hardware store man up the street. I learned to beg for things. I learned to gather the things around me I needed. So I learned some things about providing what other people did not know to provide. My mother didn't know. My parents divorced when I was 6 years old. Well, they went into separation and the divorce was final in 1947. In 1946, my mother was so concerned about it, she went back to Hawaii to be with her mother and father for a stay. She took us with her. So that was my first conscious understanding of Hawaii and experience. I'm not going to go into any more of this, but I'm just trying to show you that there, in my life, there was a repeat of events in connection with the places I'd been. And when I went back to see my grandfather in Hawaii, uh, I had experiences there that I wouldn't have ever had. He had the painting crew for the pineapple on the top of the Dole Pineapple Company, and his men would bring down the leaves and paint them and take them back up and hook them on. But we'll set this aside. I'm just letting you understand that I had a very rich childhood, beautiful experiences, and I grew in my understanding of electronics. This is very significant as you'll hear in the rest of this. I learned how circuits work. By the time I was 10 years old, I got, as a birthday present, a little crystal radio. So I started my learning about radio at the age of 10, 1950. So with those under my belt, a little bit about radio and working with my train set and understanding the switching circuits. By the time I was 12 years old, I knew how to design a small telephone company dial control switching system. I understood how it worked, and I entered a headset in the first science fair of Portland, Oregon. It was a headset like the repairmen carry with a dial on the back side of the hearing. So I had learned by the age of 12 how to build electrical things involved with radio and electronics. And then what happened was my mother married my Sunday school teacher, who was 20 years older than him. And they decided that the controversy about it was something they didn't want to deal with. And also, you had to pay a toll fee of 15 cents per run, going back and forth over the Vancouver, Portland, Oregon, Columbia River Bridge. You had to do that twice every day. He worked for Shell Oil Company on the Vancouver side. And so since so much was happening on the north side of the Columbia, they decided to move from Portland, Oregon to Vancouver, Washington. I immediately went to a junior high school for my 8th and ninth grades. And that's where my interest in mathematics began. Before, I had been given an amateur radio handbook, and I had memorized the circuit diagrams and the values of the components. That's all I knew. I did not know how to calculate any of those components. I started getting an education in mathematics. And then I went to Benson Polytechnic High School in Portland, Oregon, probably one of the best outfitted high schools in the whole nation. They had everything. In fact, they were even donated an F-86 fighter jet for their airplane department. They had everything, foundries, machines. The businesses in Portland, Oregon, whenever they had a machine that was getting on the wearing side, they had 10 standing lathes in their machine shop. The business part of the state of Portland, Oregon was extremely generous with Benson. And the boys that came out, it was a boys' school, and they came out with, they were so much into their learning and so little into the field of dating that they made very fine progress. And they had their own employment service, and the people who had made the donations to the school would go in there and they'd pick them. And they had that pre-training from the school that made them so valuable. And two of them that came out of the radio department established what is later known as Tektronix, large business. And their throwaway industry sweeping went back to Benson High School by the truckload, so they had all the parts they needed to build with. And there were so many things about Benson. I'm not going to take any more time, but it was a very wonderful experience. And one of my first experiences in being in Benson High School was coming to work with my father. His shop was just a couple blocks down, just a few blocks down the street from the school. So he brought me to school every morning. And well, that's when I heard Elvis Presley first time. And the world blew up over. I love those records. But as time went on I left Benson after only 2 years and back to Hudson's Bay High School and then to Clark College. And then I helped the computer crew building electromechanical computer stuff donated by Bell System in Seattle, Washington. And I started studying math. And last year in high school, I found a book by a man very fine. He was a teacher at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and he had written a book about the calculus. So the book was wonderful. Granted, it's one of the best books ever written on it. Introduction to Mathematical Analysis. And so I learned on my own mathematics, integral and differential calculus. Then I went to Clark College. It was just across the street. It was a junior college, a local college. And I took mathematics. I A'd the class. 2/3 of the class flunked. The teacher kind of lost interest in teaching and he didn't get it all as clear as he should have. The summer after that, I held classes at my house. I had about 10 students. And I taught them calculus and they went back and made A's and B's in the class. So as time went on, I learned things about mathematics that described how the world works. Now, I'll tell you these things because they were quite influential. I volunteered for the Navy and in September 1961. I think it was 61, 62 maybe. But anyway, I went into the Navy, wanted to be in nuclear field electronics. I had to pass their test, 98 percentile, and went to Treasure Island. And Treasure Island was my first duty station. First day in class, the teacher in the class said, "I'm fresh out of off shipboard." He says, "I don't know binary mathematics. Is there anybody in the classroom that knows it?" Well, I raised my hand. He says, "Come up, you're going to be the teacher today." So I taught the class that day, and they had a homework session at the end of the day. This was the first day of class. And they did very simple problems in removing decimal points. It's called scientific notation. I did my work, and the class was over. The next day, the class, I taught that subject again. He wanted me to teach it. He said at the end of the class, "Well, it's true, obviously you're going to be bored in this class." So he says, "I've made arrangements with a couple of ensigns over in the curriculum department. We want to bring you over there so you can help assemble our textbooks." Well, I went to my homework class that night, and a 25-year petty officer came in there. They're called Officer of the Deck. He was supposed to teach everybody to stay in line. And he found me reading a part of a book back in the book, and he came up to me and said, "Well, why are you reading that? Why aren't you doing what the others are doing?" I said, "Well, I was just reading something that was in our textbook." He said, "Well, you come with me," and he took me out on the boardwalk. I was walking up the walk, and he said, you could help others." I said, "They know that I can help them." And he got angry because I had an answer. He took me to the main office. He says, "I bet if I gave you a problem in Ohm's law, you'd fall flat on your face." I said, "You can give me any problem in Ohm's law or Kirchhoff's law you want, I'll solve it for you." I wasn't arrogant about it. I just made a matter-of-fact statement. He marched over to the wall, got a clipboard off the wall, and wrote me up for a marching party on the next Saturday. Well, and then sent me back to my room. The next morning, I met with the ensigns, and I explained that I'd signed up for nuclear field electronics. They said, well, you have to go through the regular Class A school, ETA school, electronics technicians, Class A school, before you can go that other route. We'll check you out at the end of those 4 years and see if you qualify for nuclear field electronics. I said, well, I had a problem. I told him the problem I had the night before with the officer. And I put in front of him a pile of my mathematical writings. I said, you can show this to anybody on this. It was at Treasure Island, San Francisco, is where the naval station. I said, you can show it to anybody you want to. They'll confirm if the work is done correctly. He said, well, you go back to your classroom and we'll consider this. And so I went back to my classroom. A runner came in about 15 minutes later. She took me up to the office. There was a man that I'd been connected with was swearing in the back of the room. He came forward. He said to the runner, he said, you take him to a good doctor. Don't leave him until he's in the hands of a good doctor. So he took me over to the psychiatrist's office. He said, you won't leave, will you? And I said, no. About 3 minutes or so later, in comes a man with civilian clothes on. He had civvies, as they say. Unlocked the door and said, and it was what you call a contract psychiatrist. He said, what's your problem? And I told him what happened. He said, well, it's clear what's wrong here. You're too creative for the Navy. So he says, you can pack up your the library books back, pack up your belongings. And he says, I've got a man going to Oakland Naval Hospital in Oakland, California at 12 o'clock in the afternoon at noon. I want you to go with him. So I followed his instructions and went up to the Naval Hospital in Oakland, California, Oakland Naval Hospital. He took me straight to the D ward, which is a discharge ward, Ward D. That was for observation. They had to go through that routine. And so what happened at that point was, I was under observation. I had to hang around there. I played in their entertainment at the end of the week. Finally, I was called up before the doctor. And he said, I understand you had a problem with one of our officers. He says, it's going to follow you, this record on you is going to follow you all the way through the Navy. He said, do you want to get out of the Navy? And I said, whatever you say, sir. He said, well, we're going to release you from the Navy, and we're going to keep our 25-year petty officer. They sent me back to the discharge barracks on Treasure Island, and I was out of there 5 months and 13 days. You see, if they'd have waited another 15 days, making it 6 months, I would have had $800 worth of veterans benefits. So they were in a hurry to get me out of it. But it was a full discharge, honorable discharge. I went back home. I started a little business that summer. And invited a person to work with me. They'd been on a high school computer crew. And my first name of my business was a Thought and Think Factory. It stands for Research and Development. And we got into all kinds of interesting situations there. And an advertisement came, well, I'll keep this short. In September of 5 years went by, and in September of 1967, I was home. I returned from Phoenix, Arizona, where I'd been in a court process. And I had a question about Pearl Harbor, and I went to my mother to ask about what the truth about something about neighbors, my uncle being involved in shooting a plane out of the sky. Uh, that was came in close over the trees. And I said, "What's that all about?" Because as a child, I heard it one way, but children don't know how to understand that stuff. And my father talked about Pearl Harbor, but not enough that I understood any of it. And my mother said, "Well, you'll have to ask your father about that." So I went to my father's place. He had a business making rest-a-phones. That was his invention. His crew had just gone. It was about 5 o'clock in the evening. And I asked my father about that. He said, "Son, that's not accurate." He said a Japanese plane came down the street and shot a hole in our water tower. And he said, "That's not what happened." And then he started telling me about Pearl Harbor. He started telling me about Pearl Harbor, and it went on and on and on. And I had never seen my father cry before. I just have to settle down here because I get to a point that it brings back some very stout memories. I never seen him cry, but I saw my father go into total grief as he told me all of these things. And I could see that it was working on him mentally inside, tearing him apart. And he couldn't do anything about it. He couldn't get away from the experience. It was too deep. He'd been in too many things that plunged into his brain. He says, "Dad, you're gonna have a heart attack or something. We gotta take care of this. I can write a book on it, or I can write a newspaper on it." He said, "Son, you can't do that. My uncle has been on military benefits. He's got a retirement benefit, and he has hospitalization benefits. And I promised my uncle I would never tell the story to the public until he died." I said, "Well, Dad, I could do something." "No, son, you can't do that." And it was left at that. Well, 2 years later, the My Lai massacre happened in Vietnam, where Lieutenant Calley and a group of people slaughtered a village. And our government was lying every way they could figure out how to lie themselves to get themselves out of that jam. But I was so disgusted that I said, "That's it. No more lies." So I sat down and I wrote out the story my father told me as best I could with 2 years of time. And I sent it off to all 535 people in the United States Congress, 435 representatives, and 100 senators. I sent them all a copy of that story. Well, then I got to thinking, this thing's got to be accurate, absolutely accurate. So I decided to send my father a copy of it and give him about 3 days to get wound up. He did. I called in and I said, "Dad, well, what did you think of the thing I wrote?" He said, "Well, son, it's not exactly correct." I said, "Well, what's wrong with it?" And then he started telling me what was wrong with it, and that blossomed out into a repeat of the story. Well, I put a tape recorder on that telephone line and I got it on tape. But this time when I wrote it up, it was the thing that he said, not it was just my remembrances of it. So I got a very good statement from my father. It was not as long as a statement that you got here, but it was enough that I just read, but it was enough for a book. And so I wrote the new statement, the corrected statement, sent copies to all 535 people in Congress again, 435 representatives and 100 senators. Well, that began a study on my part to check the sources of what my father said. And I did that. I did it until 1973. And I got a conversation with Admiral Prince Powell's wife, several other people. also contacted Admiral Kimmel's family. I'm trying to think of his son's name, Tom Kimmel or something like that. And so I got enough information. This is just a second. Mrs. Powell, Admiral Powell's wife, said something that was very interesting to me. She said she had a copy of the Winds Execute, WINDS Execute, EXCUTE, EXECUTE. The Winds Execute was a message with regard to the attack of Pearl Harbor. Obtained, it was a Japanese message, as I understand. And her husband had the copy. It had been lost. Nobody knew where it was, and she had it. And the FBI, after he died, the FBI came to her house and demanded it, and she gave it to them. She said, I felt I couldn't have that. That was her statement about it. But I got recordings talking with her too. So I was satisfied that my father was at that level with me and told me the truth. There was never any change. And so I wrote the book, The Skeleton in Uncle Sam's Closet, about my family's involvement in Pearl Harbor. That was published in 1973. And when that came out, my father and my father's uncle and my father's uncle's wife threatened to sue me over it. And I thought, well, that would be a fine way to get it advertised a bit. But it never happened. They never did follow through with the suit. I'm very grateful for that. But I ran out of copies. I only had 1,000 copies were provided to me by the publisher. When I went in to have that book published, it was with a mimeograph. And it looked poor, and the man that looked at it had his own copy. He said, this is something better than a mimeograph. So he had his staff retypeset the whole thing and gave me a gift of 1,000 copies of Skeleton in Uncle Sam's Closet. I sent it right off. I wished I had now, but I sent 535 copies to Congress, every congressman, representative, and senator. And my feelings about that are that I wasted the copies on it. But nevertheless, I had a few to give away. They were all gone by 1975. I went to my father about it. But by that time, my father was actually probably relieved that the story was out. I said, Dad, I'm out of copies. I need a bunch of copies. I want to put out a 20-page tabloid. He said, well, how much is that going to cost? I said, well, I'd like 15,000 copies. It's going to cost $200 for 500 copies, for 5,000 copies. It'll cost $600. And so he said, well, son, I'll do it on one condition, that I get to edit it. And the things he edited out of the book were my unpleasant statements about my father's uncle. Because you see, I didn't understand military intelligence. I didn't realize that it had to go through channels. So I thought, well, I don't understand this. Here's Mason Van Dyke with the information. He could drive with his car across to where Kimmel and Short were, and he could hand him this information without it going through Washington, D.C. And he didn't do it. I thought he was derelict in what he was doing. Well, time went by, I understood differently, but he wanted to edit out the things that were not complimentary about his uncle. And I can understand that. Well, anyway, I got the day they were running the copies on the press, the machine wasn't working right. It was throwing creases in the front page. And so by the time they had 15,000 copies of that newspaper out, there was a pile of 5,000 of them that were being rejected because of the front cover. They were going to throw them. I asked him, what do you do with the rest of those? He said, we recycle them. I said, can I have them? He said, yes, take them. So I got an extra 5,000 copies. I stacked them up next to my door at my house. And when people would come through, there were lecturers on law. They'd say, oh, we'd like some of those for us. Tables to sell. I said, you can take a whole bunch of them. I had I had a huge pile of them. And so it came out right that way. But the thing that happened from that point forward was a very deep switch in my life. Because between 1967, when I learned about it, and I put 20,000 copies, almost every copy out. They went even to Japan. And so what happened at that point was that there was a little group of people who were a man by the name of Sylvester Air who had a sign shop, and he did put materials together for my father at advertising. And on Thursday nights, he let constitutional people come in there and have their talks Thursday evening. And I got involved. I won't go into details, but I got involved with them and started helping them analyze their legal paperwork. I realized there was a very definite need for that. So, and the Pearl Harbor thing needing to be protected and exposed over the period of years. And the problem was that there was a mystery there every December. Nobody seemed to be satisfied they had all the answers. Well, I was in electronics and I loved electronics, but I also love my country. So I gave up the electronics and I became a non-union lawyer. That means I'm not an attorney. I'm a constitutional non-union lawyer. Became a pro bono lawyer. That means free service or at a reduced cost. I started my business in February of 1975 as a non-union lawyer. Now I kind of crossed the border on that a little bit. I started technical training clubs for kids and taught kids how to build radio things. And I have some very successful students at it. But that was all I did in electronics. I didn't engineer anymore. And so I started getting involved in the wickedness, the situations, the wickedness of our courts. And so I went on helping people, analyzing their cases, showing them how to write documents, how to analyze their problems, strategy. I had a wonderful strategy teacher. And so as the time went on, I learned about criminal process. I could give you all kinds of stories from here of what happened. The common man on the street has no idea the depth of this. But anyway, I had a very, very good strategy teacher. He taught me that all the strategies are in the words. If you know the words that describe the situation, you can figure out the strategy. And that had some long, I would like to hold a course on this program and teach you law. But the most important things about it is that I learned, number one, you don't use case law in the courts. Case law is judicial opinion. It's not legislated. It's not law. It's judicial opinion. And when you bring up any case references to case law in a courtroom, what you're doing is you're giving permission to the judge to be a legislator, and he's going to create anything in that courtroom he wants to ruin you. You have to know this other very important point. There's a difference between a lawyer and an attorney. If you go back into old England, you find that the kings rewarded their knights with property, they became the landlords. And under them worked the people, worked the property. They were called serfs. And in England, you have a class structure, which means there are people that are very rich and people poor, and there's stratification between them. And what happened was that when a knight wanted to move his property from himself and hand it over to another knight, a different landlord, the process was called to turn over the property. The word for it is to attorn the property, A-T-T-O-U-R-N. And the people who conducted that ceremony to make sure that the rich stayed rich and the poor stayed poor were called attorneys. That's where the word comes from. And that's exactly what attorneys are in this country. Their purpose is to keep the rich rich and the poor poor. The lawyers are the ones who believe in the equal protection and right to equal protection and right of due process, regardless of whether they're rich or poor. The attorneys are labor union operators. The judges are the union bosses in the courtroom. The attorneys are the laborers. And the judge in backroom sessions teaches the attorneys what they want them to do or not want them to not do. And the attorneys have to follow that. I know that that's true because I was brought before the court by a public defender in the Montana Freeman case. And the judge I had done processes against was in charge of that. And when he saw me come through the door to be a witness in that case, he yelled out, "Sidebar." He called all the attorneys to him and told them, if anybody puts Mr. Van Dyke on the stand, I'm taking their bar cards. And I'm going to put Mr. Van Dyke under arrest. That's the power a judge has. Don't ever forget it. And when you're assigned a public defender, they're an attorney. And the public attorney that's your public defender is coached by that judge. And that attorney will do what he's supposed to do, or he loses his bar card. And when you discover things like that, when you're going up the chain of command and you're learning, you know that there are problems we have in our country. Big problem. The Basic Bar Association has its main union shop in Great Britain. Attorneys are members of the legal system of the King of England. That's the last stronghold the King of England has on America, is the attorneys. That's why our forefathers said there will be no titles of nobility. Well, attorneys have a title of nobility called Esquire. They were the people that took care of the knights. And so we have no business having attorneys here. And there's been an attempt to push them all out of the country back to England. And the reason is they keep the rich rich and the poor poor. They're not honest. They can't be trusted. They have title of nobility, and they're violating the Constitution, which they do regularly. They commit treason against the United States. So you learn these things as you're working through this. Another thing that you need to understand is the Internal Revenue Service. Well, I'm going to get off into this, or just take a side trip down this path right now. We're going to go back into history a little bit. That history involves what's known as the it's called the got ahead of myself again. I think I'll go this route. There was a man whose name was Rothschild. He had Rothschild was a red shield, that was the sign on his business. The family's real name, as I understand it, was Bauer. They received money from the rich. They wanted it safekeeping. So he kept it in his coin shop and issued certificates on paper up to the rich so they could conduct business without hauling the gold around with them. That's fractional reserve banking. This is how it works. He found out that 90% of the gold always stayed in his shop. But because of that, he thought, well, such a deal. What I'll do is I'll produce currency based on what's here, even though it's not mine to give away. And so he produced certificates representing gold that he had no backing for. And he circulated them on the street. They had a good positive effect, was it? They made it possible to close barter without having any problems. But there was a problem, a real problem connected with this later, as time went on. He had 5 sons. He gave them all opportunities to have banks in other countries, Italy, France, Spain, England. And then we got the Federal Reserve, but it was called the First Bank of the United States in the beginning. So they had this project. They would use the gold they had as backing for part of it, but they created a bunch of it that wasn't backed by gold. And they hoarded it and spent it on the projects they wanted to spend it on. That creates problems. Well, that same thing happened eventually, propelled them into a position in the Federal Reserve Corporation. The process in the Federal Reserve Corporation was the same. 1913 they came in. There's so much to be said about this. You have to pick it close. But what happened was the Internal Revenue Service was produced too. It was the backdoor to the Treasury of the Federal Reserve Corporation. You look at Internal Revenue Service paperwork, and it says Department of the Treasury. It doesn't say Department of the U.S. Treasury or the U.S. Department of Treasury. It says Department of the Treasury. That's the Federal Reserve Corporation. What they've been doing over the years is they will go down to the county recorder's office with a notice of tax lien. And they're ordered to put it on the tax lien index, not the notice of tax lien index, but the tax lien index. And the instruction for them to do that is called the Federal Tax Lien Registration Act, or Federal Tax Registration Act. It's in Washington State, it's Revised Code of Washington 60.68.045. And it says that the notice of lien will be provided to the county clerk or recorder, but she will put it on a tax lien index. Notice it came in as a notice of tax lien and it gets put on the record as a tax lien. A notice of federal tax lien is an NFTL, a tax lien is an FTL. So she is ordered to defraud the index by changing the name of the instrument. A notice of federal tax lien has as its purpose to tell you where the federal tax lien is, and that's all. A notice of federal tax lien is not a lien, but it's supposed to tell you where you can find the tax lien itself. But there are no tax liens themselves. So they tell it after it's filed as a tax lien on the tax lien index. They're told, the IRS agent tells them to make a certificate, a sworn certificate of what's on the tax lien index. They take that notice, that tax lien index to the sheriff, pass it off as a tax lien, and get the sheriff to take property. They take that notice of tax lien in the form of a certified tax ledger to the banker to get the banker to give away the banking account. And they take it to the employer to get money out of the person's wages. So what has happened is that the Internal Revenue Service has been embezzling money from the American people continuously, year after year after year. It's 100% against the law. It's a fraudulent operation. There are no tax liens. The only tax liens you might find will be in Washington, D.C., and it will be on huge buildings and boats and things like that, aircraft, but not in the regular not on the regular streets of America. They use nothing but notices of federal tax lien. They never define where the tax lien is. They have no invoices to support their charges. It's all a fake. Everybody has the right to claim all their past taxes back into their own hands because the transaction was not legitimate. Well, there's dangers in that, but if you're willing to take them on, they run the other way if you get strong enough. We had a man that recognized that tax lien situation. He understood that the reds we had United States notes, and they were had three different colored seals: red, green, and blue. Red stood for labor, green stood for what do they call it? Capital goods and services. Basically, capital was the blue seal, goods. Others that are used consumables, what they call it, or called green, like agriculture. Agriculture was the fundamental consumable, and the red was labor. The red represented blood. So we had capital. That's the CGS currencies, capital goods and services. Well, capitals and goods are tangibles, and so they were played with as backing or pretend backing for the green seal notes. The red seal notes, though, were intangibles. They were service, not something you can weigh on a scale. So they put all the income tax, they pretended it was theirs and they could spend it without consent of the legislature, or they would engage the legislature to borrow the money from them at interest, and then let the legislature create ways of spreading the money out. So they laundered their foreign money on the street through the legislature of the United States with the help of a lot of attorneys. So we have a situation there. So what happened from there? Well, Federal Reserve Corporation followed the same rules as Rothschild. They had so much that they got covered with gold and silver, and they were printing money other than that, 90% of it, and they boasted about it in a book called Money Mechanics. And so what was going on was that they were producing 10% real currency and 90% currency that was not backed. But you have to understand something, and this is very important to the country. Any money that is printed does not have backing, like gold, silver, capital goods and services. Any money that does not have that backing represents the energy of the sun and invention. Those are the things that it represents. Because people have created this world, I'm talking about the monetary world and the gadgets man makes with his inventions. Those inventions learn to tap the power of the sun and bring it to the hands of people and give them some energy to work their business and their life. The sun makes the heat of the desert, shines on the desert, produces heat, which makes the air move and the wind, which goes over the oceans and picks up the moisture evaporated from the sea. That moisture forms clouds, goes over the land. It cools, drops its rain into rivers, go into lakes, and the lakes have the effect of going down the turbines, spinning the generators, giving us electricity, and then off to the sea goes the water. So, the other thing the sun provides is agriculture. The chlorophyll molecule in food jacks apart the water molecule, the H2O in the triangle, and steals the carbon dioxide, the carbon out of the carbon dioxide, plunks it in the middle of the water molecule, it becomes a sugar molecule. It's our energy source. in our lives, in our bodies. Those things come from the sun. Petroleum products come from the earth. They are representative of the activity within the earth. We are not sure yet what that is. Maybe they seem to be regenerated. But all of that money that's printed extra represents the sun. If you look at Matthew 5, verse 45, you see that it's recognized that it falls on both the rich and the poor. And so the idea is any money that is printed by a bank or any treasury system or any printer that is not backed is a fiduciary, is what's called a facilitator currency. It facilitates trade. It makes it possible to close bargains because otherwise the money can be hoarded and run out of service. So they need facilitator currency to handle all these inventions and other things. Facilitator currency is legitimate, but there's a condition on it that must be understood. A bank cannot create that money for itself. It can't hoard it. It's supposed to be delivered to everybody equally over the whole planet, and especially within the nation. What this means, you people think you're in a problem. Well, the man that tried to put the red seal currency back got killed over it. His name was John F. Kennedy. He tried to bring the red seal currency back because it represented the labor of the American people since 1913. And so he was murdered over it. The plain fact is that money still exists. It is still your money. You have a right to all your taxes back because they have not given you an honorable constitutional government. The Fifth Amendment says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And you can't get just compensation in the courts today. You don't get due process of law. You get the game they want to play. And it's a money game. Strictly a money game. So, what do you do about this? All of your counties can create assemblies. That's First Amendment, the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition their government for a redress of grievances. Well, the board petition doesn't need to be in there. You have every county can have their own assembly. The money of that county comes from the laborers. If they use the assembly as a bank, and they keep all the money in the assembly for the county. If the state wants money, they have to put in a bill for it. They have to put in an invoice for it. If the military wants it, or if the federal government wants it, they got to put a bill in for it, because that money belongs to the people. That's called sun money because the money comes from the sun. So what happens is their assemblies can manufacture all the money they need for the community, but there's a catch. If you give people too much money, they get lazy. They don't produce anymore. And so you can only put as much in circulation as is necessary to handle debt, to handle the transactions of money, to provide a facilitator currency. But you can't produce so much that people won't work for it. So that's the key to it is all the excess money over that which is backed by capital goods and services, all the rest of the money that's out there in circulation, this sun money, this facilitator money, and it belongs equally to all the people. So if you want money to put this nation on its feet right now, instantly, you give as much money to every single person in equal amount as it takes to get the power going again. You don't have to be poor. As a nation of people, you're all entitled to an equal partition of money, and you don't have to go to a government for it at all. It's yours. You're the ones that built this thing. You're the workers. The bankers and the governments just play with your money and then do what they want to with it, and they make powerhouses out of it for themselves. But all that money belongs to you. That's above and beyond the contract money of capital goods and services. You have basically three types of money. You've got contract money, which is the currency that's on the street, and your bank checks. You've got sun money, which comes from the represents the energy of the sun, and that's your money. That's the money that you divide amongst you equally to make your money system work. The government has no right to control it. The 10th Amendment says there will be certain things reserved for the government, and anything but outside those reserves goes to the states and to the citizens separate underneath it. Well, that has to be inverted because the people are the ones that provide the money. It's their energy. That energy belongs to the people. It's their money, not to be played with. It can be invoiced for necessity, but that money is the people's money, and you people can have that money. You don't have to go to the government, but you have to form assemblies and agree upon what you're going to give away is equal to everybody, and the remaining part of it to make it possible to run whatever assembly you have to have. I wrote a book called How to Create Currencies for Local Communities. How to Create Currencies for Local Communities. It's a free read on the internet. It's available. It's released to the public domain. Anybody can reproduce that book and sell it and make a profit off of it. They can hold lectures. We have that book at the table at the back of the room. They don't have to pay me any royalties for it. I've released it to the public domain. I explained the things that I just explained to you in that book. It angered the Federal Reserve. I just barely put that book out on the street. Just barely put it out on the street. And what happened was they put me under arrest, put me in prison as a public, as a political prisoner in the system. They gave me 7 years and 4 months because they did not want that book published. A man found a copy of it, discovered that it was released to the public domain. It was about 3 years after I was put in prison. And he published that book. Jason Whitney was his name. And I'm taking this time right now to say, God bless you, mister. You made my day when it came to prison, because when I saw that you put that book out at the 3-year mark and people got it, I was so thrilled to see that book out because I was in the condition where I couldn't do it. So this is my thank you to you, and I hope somebody tells you I thanked you for it. But they kept me 7 years and 3 months, 7 years and 4 months in prison. When I came out, I made sure that all my writings on these subjects are released to the public domain so they can be reproduced by anybody in any quantity, anywhere, any way they can do it. I want you to know that. And I don't expect any money back in return for it. I just want the public to know. I want them to understand their rights, their powers, and get on with life. There is no need whatsoever in this country for anybody to be poor. Kennedy knew that. He knew that it had to be, all the tax had to be revised. The Internal Revenue Service had to be put out of business because they were not putting liens on the street. They were putting notices of liens on the street. It was all fraud. It's still all fraud. And anybody that goes along filling out the forms for the Internal Revenue Service and paying into that thing are encouraging the Internal Revenue Service to further commit the crimes. So you need to be protective of yourself in that respect. So much for the Federal Reserve and the Internal Revenue Service. The Federal Reserve has no right to print the extra money. The assemblies of the people have all the right to print the money. And they have to stay in contact with each other so that they're all in the same level for the facilitator currency. Because if they aren't, then when you go from one state to another, you'll have to calculate all the price changes. But as long as all of the assembly groups in the nation provide the same amount of money to each and every person, there's no problem with it. There's no violation of the law. The law stays with the people because they're the ones that created the money in the first place. So you see, it's a very simple thing. Tomorrow you could start that up if you had your assembly. You could start your assembly in a week or whatever you want to do, and you could put out a dictation to every bank in the county that that assembly is in, and tell them we want you to add $2,000 or 5,000 or whatever it is to everybody's bank account in this county. Now that will upset the balance with respect to the neighboring county, but you can bet your bottom dollar that when they see this happen, they're going to want to do it too, and it'll sweep across this land like wildfire. You can bring this country back on its feet economically instantly, almost instantly, by just printing your own money and distributing it in equal proportions to the people. That's in the first 22 pages, 23 pages of my book, How to Create Currencies for Local Communities. How much are we in on time?
Probably 15 minutes.
15 minutes to go?
Yeah.
Okay, I got a couple more things to say. Oh, how much? Just a second, I gotta get this straight. No, you don't have to go anywhere. 15 minutes for this particular of an hour and a half.
Yeah, I'm on air now.
Why don't I just keep going, and whatever's left it's time you can fill that with other things. It's just so we got another hour and a half I can go.
No, 15 minutes. I have to go on air in half an hour.
What?
I have to go on air in half an hour.
Oh. Well,
if you'd like, you can wrap it up and we can continue on maybe tomorrow or the next day.
No. I want to make something clear to you people. It's something you got to know. You got a virus problem in this country and all over the world. Part of the virus is there's a virus in the virus. What it boils down to is that somebody, I'm going to tell you this because I had to, when my wife died, she was declared dead, taken in by the coroner. I promised her promised that I would keep her in state for 3 days. She had diabetes and didn't want to be buried because of her diabetes problem. Please. So they came and took her away. She collapsed. They called it. They said she was dead. They put the sheet over her. They did all those things. They took her into the office of the coroner. And my mother and I went down and told her mother what had happened, that she died. And I remembered the promise then that I had given. So when we came back from Salem, Oregon, I had my mother let me off at the coroner's office, and I ordered them to put my wife back in the truck and take her back to the house, which they did. When I got her to the house, I washed her body, and I started doing the only thing I knew to do, which was to give her a respiration study. And the way I did it was I washed her body. I set her on, she was set on the bed, and I wasn't going to be moving her because I didn't have the strength to move her. By that time, I'd gone through 4 weeks of horror over this thing. I wasn't very strong. I was in a state of shock, but I knew enough to put her on the bed, pull her down on the bed so that her feet were hanging beneath. Her butt was right on the edge of the bed, and her feet were hanging down to the floor. So I raised her feet. Her face changed from white to red. The blood had flowed down to that end of her body. I lowered her feet down to the floor. Her feet turned red. Her head turned white. Then I raised her feet up against above the edge of the bed, higher. Her head went red. Her feet went white. So it was perfectly clear that the blood was flowing back and forth in her body. And she was picking up oxygen through her skin. What you have to understand is the concept of death is arbitrary in the medical field. They finally, in the 1970s, decided that the sign of death was stopping of brain activity. Well, that's not accurate enough. Between life and death, there are a sequence of changes: hibernation, coma, and what do you call it, suspended animation. Those are three known stages. So I kept, as cautiously as I could, but I had to take breaks once in a while. I kept raising and lowering my wife's feet with that change in color of her skin. I went on and on doing that for 3 days. And finally, she was responding. She was swallowing. I got her back to the point that she had swallowing reflexes. And that was Thursday. She died on a Monday. And that was the third day, the Thursday. And the coroner stayed, or the coroner people stayed away until the end of that evening when it was everybody else was going to sleep at night. And they came in, the one man came in and took her body away. And what had happened during the day is I'd gotten the swallowing reflexes. I called the St. Joseph's Hospital in Vancouver. We were living in Battleground, Washington. I called the coroner and she told him that my wife was having swallowing reflexes. What should I do? He could give me no answer. I called up St. Joseph's Hospital. I called and asked, and they couldn't tell me anything. I called the coroner's office. He couldn't give me anything. But then what happened was the man showed up very quickly at the end of the day, as if he didn't want any neighbors to see him coming and taking that body. They went to the coroner. They went to the mortician. The mortician treated my wife, and she was given the, what do you call it, formaldehyde. I later talked with him about the situation. He explained to him he had his mortician business was in Eugene, Oregon. He told me he had two slabs in his mortuary. One was where he did his work, and the other was a warm-up slab. So when he had to work on the body, he would pull it out of refrigeration and put it on the working slab, and go back on the waiting slab, and go back to work on his mortician slab, the preparation slab. And he told me he had two experiences where the people came back after they were brought out in refrigeration. That they had been brought out, and he had to send them back to the hospital. A quick look at this means it happens in all the mortuaries, on all the coroner's offices. They have a lock on the door. They don't want people to walk out on the street because it's an embarrassment to the doctor or the coroner's office that these people actually come back to life. And when they come back to life in that serene situation, they are killed so they don't ever become, or at least they're put in a stabilized condition so they can be sent to doctor's offices to provide donor parts for operations. And what you're looking at in this virus situation is an opportunity for doctors to have an amazing amount of bodies delivered to them that they can take body parts from. In other words, if a person is destined for the crematorium, when he's released to be put in the crematorium, in that small gap of time between when they're declared dead and when they go to the crematorium, there's an availability of that body to be sold to the medical profession as body parts for transplant operations. So what you're looking at is a very big business in transplant. And you should say that this is exaggerated. It's not exaggerated. You got 60,000 circumcision doctors doing $1.2 billion worth of business a year, saving the foreskins and selling them to people that are doing plastic surgery and skin repair. And I could bring up other people that would confirm this even further. That these people, it's not what it appears to be. Johns Hopkins University declared just a couple days ago, this is what the 10th, 11th, huh?
It's the 13th.
This is 13th? 2 days ago, Johns Hopkins University admitted that the number of deaths by surgical mistakes is 250,000 a year. And so what you're looking at is a lot of the stuff that's normal, but the people that have problems with their body are weak, and when they get hit with a virus, whether it's a flu or any other virus, they get knocked off the knocked off their lives go on. So you have to start looking at this virus thing in a different way. And if you're in a household that's been sealed off, I mean, you're not allowed to go out on the street. But somebody in your office, in your house, has a collapse of their system and it looks like death. Try to find out if there's a pulse. If there's no pulse, immediately put them on a bed and start doing this respiratory system. If you want a better solution to put on the body to carry more oxygen in, you can use hydrogen peroxide. That will provide some. DMSO is another one that will carry substance in. And the chemical reaction between DMSO and hydrogen peroxide is called MSM. So you can find MSM in your pharmacies. It's considered a food, not a drug. And you can also get what's called colloidal silver. There are many people making it. And you put one MSM tablet in a container, a 1 cup container.
Be very careful.
Well, I'm told I can't prescribe medicine, but
Have them just say they can look it up.
I'm told I can't prescribe medicine. Tell you what,
It'll get the channel.
I'm going to say what's on my mind. I'm not representing anybody else's opinion. But I can't, if I keep my mouth shut about these things, there's going to be a few people dying. I'm going to feel responsible for it. So I'm not going to go along with her saying you can't talk. The FDA and the medical profession are up to their neck. They're in bed with each other. It's the medical profession for finances the FDA. I can tell you some real stories there because I know some of those stories. The FDA and the medical profession are hand in glove, and their occupation is to make money. It has nothing to do with love of people or caring about their health. And the medical profession is always selling what is called symptomatic medicine. They're not selling you the medicine that is able to heal you, herbs and things like that. The primary source of herbs at the turn of the century, 1900, was Park Davis. The Park Davis Company had what they called crude botanicals. When petroleum chemistry came into position, it started being used to create medicines. Park Davis moved over to that, apparently. Well, the problem with making medicines that have what you call the active ingredient is when you pull the active ingredient out of an herb, you leave a bunch of other chemicals behind. And those chemicals that they leave behind are the ones that protect you from the chemical disbalance caused by the primary thing they're trying to sell. In other words, they take out when the plant was alive. When it was alive, the chemistry was balanced, because if it wasn't, it wouldn't be alive. You have to understand that. But when they take the active ingredient out of that pile, you lose the chemistry necessary to keep that active ingredient from causing you that damage. So these are all things you need to understand. Look up the book, How to Create Currencies for Local Communities. Look up the book, Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. I wrote that book. How to Create Currencies for Local Communities. That book. And there's also another one. The Skeleton in Uncle Sam's Closet. Those are all available on the internet. They're all free to be published by anybody that wants to. And keep in mind always that the medical profession's primary objective is money. Selling body parts, using body parts, and getting them from people that are headed for the crematorium. That's what you have to understand there. So that much is clear. And what else can I
Any
say?
last words?
By the way, I'm going to give you my address and telephone number. My address is Post Office Box, Hartford Van Dyke, Post Office Box 831, Kettle Falls, Washington. Kettle like kettle on the stove. Kettle Falls, Washington 99141. My telephone number 509 738 3039. I'll repeat those. Post Office Box 831, Kettle Falls, Washington 99141. And the telephone number is 509 738 3039. If you need any more information, feel free to call for it. Just remember, at 6 o'clock my time, I might start shutting down my night. Don't call me after 6 at night. I'm available from 11 in the morning, Washington time, Oregon time. And I'm available basically till 2:30 in the afternoon, anytime, but as late as 6 o'clock if it's an emergency.